All right, so I would like to talk to you a little bit more about 3 of the characteristics that I listed in my checklist method. So those would be ownership, perspective, and purpose. And what I think you'll see is that ownership, perspective, and purpose all kind of tend to overlap each other. So when we talk about one, we end up kind of talking about all of them. So to talk about these 3 characteristics, I'm going to use a real-life website because I think it's important to talk about these in the context in which they appear. So this website is called the Institute for Energy Research. And this is actually a website that I've had a student turn in to me before on their synthesis matrix assignment. And this particular article is about the history of U.S. offshore oil drilling. And when I look around this website, I'll notice that a lot of the articles tend to be about fossil fuels. So I should say that from my librarian perspective, I'm already a little bit on edge when I see this website. Fossil fuels are a particularly controversial topic, so this has already kind of raised my red flags, which is an emotional response, and we'll talk about those later. But it's really also alerting me to the fact that I need to probably investigate this source a little bit further to determine whether or not it's credible and trustworthy. So this particular article doesn't have an author. It just says it's by IER. And so I want to start thinking about who the owner of this particular website is, and whether or not that owner might have a particular perspective that might cast doubt on the information being presented. So if I go over here to the About page, I can learn a little bit more about who the Institute for Energy Research says that they are. And so this is where we're going to get into purpose. And I'll give the Institute for Energy Research some credit here because they're actually pretty honest about what their purpose is. But I find that a lot of times the wording that they use is not particularly clear to a lot of students. So they say that they're a nonprofit organization, which is true, that conducts research and analysis on the government regulation of global energy markets. In their second sentence here, this is where it really kind of gets interesting. IER maintains that freely functioning energy markets provide the most efficient and effective solutions to today's global energy and environmental challenges. So we know that they're expressing an opinion, but this phrase, freely functioning energy markets, what does that really mean? What I find is that a lot of my economics or business or political science majors understand what this means, but sometimes not everyone really fully grasps it. And so this is really where Wikipedia can be your friend. So we talked earlier in the semester about the ways that we can use Wikipedia for research, and this is definitely one of them. So I'm going to go ahead and look up what free markets mean. And here on Wikipedia, it's going to basically tell me that free markets are free from any intervention by a government or other authority. So there's essentially no government regulation. Now, in the context of a website that's talking about things like fossil fuels and oil and energy markets, that should probably raise our suspicions if they're talking about things like deregulation of energy markets. Now it's clear when we're thinking about their perspective that they really do have a pretty strong opinion on free markets, and that their purpose in publishing this research on the web is probably to advocate for their particular point of view. We also talked about using Wikipedia to learn more about what particular websites are about, and a lot of the major websites that you're going to come across that publish this kind of information might actually have a Wikipedia page. So the Institute for Energy Research does have a Wikipedia page, and I went ahead and looked them up. When I read this Wikipedia page, I learned some pretty interesting things. First, that it's described as a front for the fossil fuel industry, so that's a yikes, we probably don't want to use that source. And also that it's funded by the Koch brothers. You may or may not have heard of them, but they tend to lean conservative and fund things that advance conservative interests. So now when I go back and I think about this particular website, I have all this context now about the ownership, its perspective, and its purpose. Now, given the context of what I'm doing, what kind of paper I'm writing, or how I plan to use this information, this might all be fine. But if I was planning to use this particular article on the history of offshore oil, and I want to present this as a neutral or unbiased source in my paper, now I might want to rethink that. What I might want to do instead is see if I can find another source that maybe also has this kind of information, but whose ownership and perspective and purpose may not be able to be called into question quite as much as this one. So the big takeaway from this particular video is just if you come across a website like this, a lot of times they look really appealing and they give off this air of neutrality or of some sort of officialness. Even their title, the Institute for Energy Research, that sounds so official and fancy. It's always worth looking up the website, seeing if it has a Wikipedia page, and if you can learn a little bit more about who owns the website, who funds the website, who pays for it, things like that.